Depois podemos ir
Yeah,
embora.
exactly. So we are recording. Ok, eu vou começar em português e vou passar brevemente em inglês. Pronto, talvez vamos passar para inglês imediatamente, since this is a hybrid event, so we have a lot of people, or maybe some people that they don't understand Portuguese. So the session will be in English, and I will speak English since now. So thank you very much for joining us in today's session of our Social Movements and Political Action Seminar Series. We are very happy to have you here, and also to have our guest of today, Ruy Llera Blanes, who is a friend and colleague. And it's a real pleasure to have him here and to discuss about this topic, which is very interesting, important, and particularly relevant for the ongoing days. Before introducing our today guest and today's seminar, I would like to just spend some few words about our seminar series. So this is the Social Movements and Political Action Seminar Series. It has been existing for 10 years. We celebrated our 10th anniversary in October, and we have had more than 100 sessions about many different topics related to this big field of social movements and political action, conflicts, different forms of protest and resistance around the world. Our idea and our basic principle is to give voice also to protests and forms of resistance and of action and political action that are not always recognized in our studies, in the big field of social movement studies. And so to let's say, to open a little bit the lenses of our area of studies, to include different areas of the world that are not usually included in the study of social movements. So for particularly sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, or China, or other countries from the South, and also other disciplines like anthropology, of course, as the seminar today, or geography, urban studies, social psychology, different areas of social sciences, and to create this debate and dialogue about this topic. You can see the site of the seminar here. We have had many different sessions about different topics. The next session in December will be about between questions and revolt, everyday practices and collective action. It will be talked by Marco Allegra about everyday politics and action of resistance, particularly in the urban movements in Lisbon. And another point that maybe can be interesting for some of you is that the sessions are recorded, and this also means that you can click on the page of the event, and you can have the video. So if you are interested in some session that you were not able to follow, you can go to the website and watch it whenever you want. So now I give the floor to Tiago, who will introduce Ruy and in today's seminar. Thank you again. Thank you very much for joining us today. And now I keep quiet, and I invite Tiago to here to introduce our guest.
Oh, given that the camera is there, we can we don't need to change that much, but nevertheless. So today we have Ruy Llera Blanes, as Guya was saying. I don't know if the pronunciation was good or not, given that.
How we do that?
So Ruy will present his ongoing work on just to make sure that.
I think it's probably,
Funny.
no, I think they're probably
It's
we
froze.
need to click here.
Okay, it's back. So we'll present his ongoing work in but we lost the camera.
Yeah, but
See, just a moment. I do this and I take care.
his ongoing work on anti-extractivist movements in Mozambique, which will tell us a bit more about it in a few minutes. Is an anthropologist and today a researcher here at ISCTE and associated with CRIA, which is a collective of research centers, so to say, in anthropology here in Lisbon, right? And into past. He has developed a lot of work on Angola related with religion, memory, temporality, heritage, landscape and environment, but also human rights and activism. And most recently, he initiated this research on Cabo Delgado in Mozambique on the impact of extractivist projects and energetic transition. And also he has a couple of books published, A Prophetic Trajectory and an Angolan Revolution in the 20th Century, published last year. And
See if click this again, see what happens. Yeah.
and so yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so thank you for being here with us, Ruy. It's really a pleasure to finally meet you. I've known of your work for many years, but never really got the chance to meet you. And so please, the floor is yours, and I'll give you the PowerPoint and
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Tiago and Guya. It's a great pleasure to be in the seminar. We were reminiscing that actually I presented here many years ago, so many years ago that we don't really remember exactly when. But yeah, I've been following the seminar, so it's really nice to be here. Is it working? Or...
This is impressive. So
Yeah, I don't know if when you do something there. Oh, there you
Yeah.
go. No, it was there. It was there.
no.
Ah,
no.
sorry.
So fantastic technology. I'm sorry.
Too much technology.
Now we lost the video again.
Ah, okay, video, yeah.
Now we need to find a way to push this.
Maybe it's because you have too many programs open.
But I don't have too many programs open. It's just have.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Is it good like this?
Yeah, then so just to
Yeah,
it's
just
here. Okay, put it down. Okay. So yeah, maybe I can just start with giving a bit of background for this research in order to explain what I've been actually been doing in Mozambique. And it actually starts with a bit of this thing kind of gets in the middle, but anyway, whatever.
You want me?
I mean, the background for this is actually research that started in Angola about 10 years ago, regarding, well, very broadly, social movements and political activism in Angola, especially in the framework of kind of post-Arab Spring social youth movements in Angola, which ended up with the book that you mentioned, The Angolan Revolution in the 21st century, not the 20th. But anyway, it was this kind of framework that got me into, as you said, for many years I was doing research in religion, but after 2015, kind of shifted my field, started thinking about different kind of social movements, which is these political activisms. And so since then, my research has been guided by an interrogation of what kind of social practices do these kinds of mobilizations in places like Angola. So I was working very specifically around these political and human rights activisms in Angola, which led to that book published last year. But then in recent years, I also opened up a different kind of field in Angola, which had to do with the kind of the situation of environmental disaster, in particular a drought, extreme drought situation that was happening in the south or southwest of Angola. So I developed a research proposal around social mobilizations around that issue, and thinking through how the environmental aspect also was being incorporated into a political agenda on behalf of Angolan civic society and very specifically Angolan activists. So that opened up this field of thinking through activism in the context of environmental issues. And at the time, I was not here in ISCTE. I was in Sweden, in Gothenburg. And since Sweden has more generous funding for Mozambique than it does to Angola for their development issues, it was a bit of a coincidence. For a long time, I wanted to go to Mozambique, and so an opportunity came up, and we built a proposal around what was happening in Cabo Delgado. So this proposal was designed in around 2017 or 18. So it's important to keep that in mind for what we're going to say in a minute. So we designed a proposal, which was actually thinking through how in the province of Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, in the border with sorry. Okay. Thanks for the reminder. In Tanzania, the border with Tanzania, how two seemingly kind of very contradictory movements were happening. So on the one hand, you would see this overarching development of extractive industries in the province. At the same time as you were observing at the time the dramatic environmental processes such as cyclones and whatnot that were hugely devastating, not only in Cabo Delgado with Kenneth, but especially in the center of the country with Tet and Sofala and things like that. And so how these two, how these seemingly contradictory movements, taking place in the same place coexisted, right? And I was interested in seeing how social, what kind of social mobilizations were happening in and around these spaces. So yeah, the context, the empirical context of Mozambique, I guess we're all more or less familiar with what was happening there. The broader context is that in the past 2 to 3 decades, Mozambique has experienced a significant, dramatic reconversion in its economy, mostly due to what we could call a kind of a new age of extractivism, in particular related to the revival of previous mining endeavors in central Mozambique and Tet with the coal industry. Becoming one of the main coal projects globally speaking, with the entrance of Vale from Brazil. And then since the 2010s, the emergence or the discovery of large reserves of offshore reserves of gas, of natural gas, which led to the development of or the implantation of large-scale extractive industry with major players, major transnational oil companies such as Total. Well, in the first instance, Anadarko, the North American company, and then Total France and Eni from Italy. At least the main actors there, several others. But anyway, this was a large overhaul in terms of the reality of this province. We're talking about I can't give you numbers right now because I don't remember, but figures that make Cabo Delgado one of the main global sources of natural gas in the world in just a matter of these last 15 years. So that was one thing. Oh yeah, and then a third episode of this process of this new age of extractivism is the discovery of graphite reserves in the southwest of the province. Of course, graphite being one of the critical minerals for this new energy transition, etc. Of course, it's also important to note that there is a longue durée in this extractivist mindset, stemming from the early colonial period with the companhias and the prazos, but then also in the post-independence period with Operação Produção and then the kind of the developmentalist age, which kind of signaled this kind of large-scale logic or projects of large-scale development and especially of determining what kind of relationships people are supposed to have with the land, what kind of what kind of livelihoods they are allowed to have in this kind of industrial, proto-industrial kind of setting, right? So you have there the colonial and the post-independence socialist period, and then you have the post-90s reform developmentalist world, and then that small picture in the right bottom corner is what I define as a new age of development with the emergence of corporate kind of CSR development projects. So Total, another major company sponsoring development projects. So this is like a story of a long array of these kinds of processes of but on the other hand, Cabo Delgado in the map of Mozambique is actually a province that you know, the experience on behalf of those who live there is actually one of, you know, being one of the poorest provinces in the country since independence, and then you know, experiencing this dramatic you know, overturn in the last years. And of course, not only with relation to these new extractive industrial projects, but also due to, as I said, to climate events, in particular, Kenneth in 2018 or 19, if I remember correctly. And also, of course, the issue of the Islamic insurgency in the region. So this is just trying to paint a picture of how dramatically things have changed in this particular part of the world and part of Mozambique. And in this framework, Cabo Delgado has actually, you know, transformed from being a, you know, a dirt poor province to a dirt rich province, at least in terms of the resources that it offers and the opportunities, business opportunities that it enables. And of course, all of these processes have led differently to also another important aspect, which has to do, with a large scale process of mobility and migration, different forms of human mobility, you know, either refugee and relocation due to either, you know, Kenneth or the Islamic insurgency, but also, you know, voluntary movements of people seeking these new spaces of development, in particular urban development in an early stage in the northern cities of Palma and Musimba, and then to a lesser extent Pemba. But then, of course, with the insurgency, these things you know, turned upside down with movements of refugee movements, especially towards the south, in and around Pemba, which is the capital. I'm not sure if, I mean, I can't really point from here, but it's the last airplane there to the to the right in the southern part of the province there. You know, cities like Pemba almost tripling the number of inhabitants in a matter of 3 to 4 years, based on these different processes. Also adding to the arrival of what people locally call vientes, you know, like expats, either international people working in the industry or just working in the response, in the emergency response. So in cities like Pemba, you'd have all these international actors, and as also the military. It was the base for the military operations of the SADC forces that are fighting the insurgency. So all this, of course, puts a lot of pressure in terms of you know, the land. The land in Mozambique is of course belongs to the state. So any kind of use and claim over the land is now regulated by these processes of the duats, right, the rights of use of the land. But of course, in the aftermath of these recent discoveries of LNG and also not only graphite more recently, but in between these different discoveries, you also have the boom of the precious stone mining industry in between, basically in the middle of the southern part of the province in and around Montepuez. So all this kind of new extractive age also had a consequence in terms of, juridical and constitutional and political movements that actually enable the, a process of occupation of the land on behalf of the state, or reoccupation on behalf of the state, but also new rights of use given to major companies and joint ventures for these mining and extractive projects, which in turn led to multiple processes of negotiation, quote unquote, with local communities across the board from north to south of the province. And what you see there in the right side of the slide is two examples. The top one is the project of the new logistics terminal in Pemba, and there you see kind of the implantation of this new design of the land, which of course implied the relocation of people who were, in this case, not so many people living there, but working there, and the kinds of negotiations that they had to do with local communities. And in the bottom right is actually what happened around the region of Palma. That the darker gray area that you see there is the area that is the new concession given to Total for their infrastructures for the LNG processing and distribution. So this has, what I'm trying to say, I guess, is that this has had dramatic effects, and also it's one of the major sources of conflicts that we are observing on the ground, right? Of these, euphemistically misunderstandings around what kind of compensation, what kind of negotiation you do with the local communities for their resettlement and dispossession of their lands. And what kind of, most of the conflicts are actually emerging from that. And also to a different extent, environmental impacts of these projects. Okay, so when it comes to, and this is just an example. Kitunda is an example of a bottom-up construction of a resettlement village, in this case sponsored by Total. Before that, it started with an Adarco, but it was sponsored by Total. This is actually just outside the border of that darker gray area. It's actually that yellow-orange spot that you see there is Kitunda. So most of the people who were resettled because of this new duat or right of use ended up there, and this is yet another source of conflict in terms of what people found when they were resettled. So how does this translate in terms of social protests? So in a way, I kind of divided this into protests and then quote unquote protests. So coming from Angola, I've kind of thought through these processes in terms of how people take the streets and use the streets as a space of expression and mobilization, right? But what I found in Mozambique was actually quite different, right? So you have this is an example just of one of hundreds of reports that different kinds of organizations have produced regarding, in this case, it actually doesn't have much to do with the sorry, this is actually in the middle of, it doesn't have much to do with the natural gas, but it does have to do with these kinds of state-sponsored and corporate-sponsored projects and their local impacts. So this is the kind of stuff that you see in terms of a protest regarding the kind of social and environmental impacts of these new extractive age, to put it one way, right? So that was this was, for me, this was a moment of, arriving to Mozambique and seeing, okay, where are the protests, right? And why do people go to the streets? And realizing that you don't really see that much in terms of people protesting against environmental issues, right? What you do see is this level of communication, of discontent, right? And this has to do with the, so to speak, with the critical, what I call the critical landscape of, I put Maputo in for one reason, because even though, my research was taking place in Cabo Delgado and interested in what kind of movements and organizations and associations I could find in that space of Cabo Delgado. in fact, most of the critical discourse concerning these projects was actually being done in Maputo, where most of these organizations, are located. So what we see is an interesting kind of mobilization stemming from either from environmental movements or different kinds of civic movements, all of them taking this aspect of the extractivism in Mozambique as a topic, and then using their kind of local research to produce reports and critiques and denouncing several different kinds of violations, either environmental or human rights violations taking place, in and around these kinds of projects. And so we're talking about, from NGOs to think tanks to research centers, social science research centers, to different kinds of platforms, right? So you have very specific actors here in Mozambique. You have like environmental, some of them, very explicitly in the framework of environmental justice movements, like Justiça Ambiental, which is connected with Friends of the Earth and other international organizations. You have Centro Terra Viva, you have Sekelekani. And then you have civic organizations, Centro de Integridade Pública, right? Centro de Democracia e Desenvolvimento, the women's WLSA, I forget the women's L, I forget what the L was. It's a feminist movement, that Southern African feminist movement that has been also mobilizing around these issues. You have platforms created, like such as Coligação Cívica da Indústria Extrativa, which congregates many of these, but not all of these organizations. You also have, an interesting mix of people either, coming from the research academic environment, but also working in consultancy a lot, and also, doing reporting from the ground in terms of what is happening in and around these projects, and in particular around Cabo Delgado. You have the Observatório do Meio Rural, you have the IES also, Instituto de Estudos Sociais e Econômicos. And a lot of them are actually, very much in these international frameworks, in particular the environmental justice movement, the Justiça Ambiental, which is very much, in international platforms. They created this one particular version of Say No to Gas, which is connected to international, international movements. From Friends of the Earth to the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, etc. And here, I think what's interesting is that you see two different strands here in this kind of critique of protest, right? Especially in the framework of the environmentalist organizations. Sorry, I forgot to pass. Yeah, this is just what in the framework of what people like environmental Justiça Ambiental are doing and Friends of the Earth. Which are actually placing the problem of Mozambique within an international framework, and in particular doing this, I guess we could call it, anti-total activism, right? So there's an explicit mobilization of people, not only in Mozambique, but of course, Total being a multinational country with a global presence, actually mobilizing in terms of denouncing the work of Total, or framing Mozambique's case with Total in a global setting of violations of different kinds of human rights and environmental issues. Yeah, I'll get to this in a minute. But yeah, so what we see in particular in terms of these environmentalist movements, you'd have, I guess, two strands. One like Justiça Ambiental, the environmental justice approach, which is actively rejecting any kind of extractive projects. They just simply anti and say, no, we don't want any kind of this. Whereas other organizations such as Sekelekani and others are actually, struggling in the framework of or fighting or doing the activism in the framework of struggling for a more just form of extractivism, right? So these two different versions or approaches to the problem. One of them accepting that this is a necessity, but doing the activism in the framework of trying to find more just, more transparent ways of doing it, whereas in the environmental justice approach is just actively against it, because they don't see any kind of positive aspect coming out of it, apart from some people getting rich. So yeah, that's the a bit of the, we could say that the shape or the form of these kinds of activism in a place like Maputo. You also have the case of UNAC, which I find quite interesting, in the sense of it being a different kind of trajectory. UNAC, of course, being the National Union of Peasants, União Nacional, Camponeses, National Union of Peasants in Mozambique, and it actually harks back to many years before all this new extractive age. So they emerged in the early 90s as kind of a reaction, kind of a more kind of unionist reaction, on behalf of farmer associations, reacting, of course, to the reforms that were taking place, the kind of the Berghahn Books thing or space or the logic that was being installed in Mozambique in the reforms in the 1990s. So they began as a kind of a union and advocacy group for struggling for union peasant rights or company farmers' rights. Well, I would say better peasants, not farmers. But eventually, throughout time, they actually, especially in the framework of the World Social Forum, Forum Social, the Porto Alegre movement, the World Social Forum. Thank you. And in particular, through the emergence of this global movement of La Via Campesina, they actually ended up joining the Via Campesina and kind of incorporating their kind of guidebook, so to speak, or their manual or their kind of strategies into their struggles to defend the rights of the peasants in Mozambique. But also doing this in the context of being one of the few organizations, due to its historical implantation, to actually have a national outreach in Mozambique, whereas in these other environmental organizations, not all of them are able to be in all provinces of the country. I mean, Mozambique is quite big, so at least from a Portuguese perspective, it's quite big. So you didn't really have any this kind of nationwide organization, but UNAC is able to do it with his provincial delegations and things like that. So. But then at the same time, what is happening with UNAC is actually not only this transformation in terms of their incorporating a Via Campesina approach, a kind of a more updated logic, incorporating environmental justice and human rights justice into their mission, but also increasingly actually working in the context of urban. So it's a peasant movement working in urban context, precisely in the framework of this new life of the land in Mozambique, right? Which is in this context of new concessions for mining and different kinds of large-scale industrial operations. And I mentioned gas and coal and precious gemstones and rubies and whatnot, but we can mention agroforestry and areias pesadas, hard. Heavy sands, I don't know if that's the correct word. A multitude of different kinds of extractivist and industrial projects that are actually shaping people's lives. But then, so then you have this example, which I think is in the middle of what I could call a more, from where at least considering my trajectory, I think it's quite interesting to observe a space of social mobilization, which is a very highly critical space in terms of these kinds of movements, doing their own research and denouncing and putting the case of Mozambique into a global conversation, and having a very, very explicit critique of what the government is doing, with very good, advocacy, knowledge, but at the same time, that is a kind of discourse that is circulating in a very restricted space, right? Which is the kind of space of intellectuals in Maputo who are, all very knowledgeable with this stuff and hypercritical. But at the same time, it's a kind of a domesticated space, in the sense of that it's a discourse that actually does, even though it's highly critical. And when coming from Angola, I was actually very positively surprised to see that you could see in a place like Mozambique this level of critique to the government. This is something you could not see in Angola, or you cannot see in Angola. But on the other hand, realizing that it's in a bit of a bubble in that sense. It's in an enclosed space, right? So this is also where my interrogations about the form and the size of these social movements come. So they are not in the streets. This is what I'm trying to say. This is something that is circulating in a particular, platforms and forms of communication, and it's also something that is its form is actually determined by a different kind of process, which has to do with the kind of the place of Mozambique within the global setting, and the kind of bilateral relationships that Mozambique has in the framework of donorship and aid, North-South aid and development projects. So you realize that a lot of money that is coming in, and that space that is allowed for this kind of critique, is actually enabled by the donor space, right? Money that comes from Sweden or Norway or Spain or whatnot, actually enables or pushes the regime into enabling this kind of space. But at the same time, it is a domesticated space, and it also depends on the agenda of the donorship, right? So now, of course, the big debate is extractivism. We'll see what it's going to be in 5 years, maybe. What is happening now in Mozambique is going to determine a new major topic in this critical thinking. 10 years ago maybe it was, or 20 years ago maybe it was HIV. So it has its own field and conditions of possibility. That's what I'm trying to say. And it is also, as I said before, not in the streets. And what's interesting is that of course this is a thing of Maputo, right? Whereas what you see in Cabo Delgado is a bit different. Oh yeah, sorry, I forgot to mention it. This is one interesting example of what it says there is actually gem fields. Sorry. Yeah, basically it's a lawsuit that it was actually based on the work of several environmentalist organizations that successfully able to mobilize and put a lawsuit against the gem fields. It is in Cabo Delgado well, like, as you can see from the title of the company, is of course related to precious stones and gemstones. And there was an accusation of several human rights violations, especially in the framework of that transition from, because there was a lot of, before the major corporations were operating, there was a lot of artisanal mining happening there. And what happened with these new concessions was that, these spaces became enclosed, privatized spaces, and people who tried to do their mining were criminalized, and a lot of them were actually killed in the process. So there was a lot of human rights violations, and this was one case of a successful example of actually taking something that was happening in Mozambique to court, in this case in London, and then they ended up with being condemned to compensation of $7 million or whatever. I don't even know what happened to that money, but what was interesting is that there was actually this possibility of, but this is more an exception than anything else. Mhm. Okay, yeah, right. Yeah. So what's interesting is that in Cabo Delgado, of course, circulating around there, you kind of come across a different kind of mobilization, and it's actually a story of people organizing and trying to protest, take the streets and protest. But in a situation of complete lack of, destitution and lack of support, right? So this case was actually related with what I was saying before about the logistics terminal in Pemba, where, what you see there, the green area was actually the area where the port is being implemented, or will be in this case. And this was a land that was used by local farmers. This was their traditional land, but they had been forced to back in the after independence to leave these areas and live closer to the streets. To the main roads that exited Pemba. But they still use this place as their mashamba, as their farming and fishing activities. And so when this project for the implementation of the logistics terminal came about in the early 2010s, these were actually people who were, had actually high expectations for this process, right? So they thought, well, on the one hand, well, we can, we might have a good compensation either in the form of money or new land. And in any case, this infrastructure will imply, more mouths to feed, so more people to buy our produce and things like that. But then, of course, when the moment of quote unquote public consultation and negotiation came about, it all went wrong. They basically claimed that they weren't consulted, and when they were called for a meeting, they were actually just being offered money, and to the level of some of these families receiving an offer of like $40 for their farming, things like that. And this created a situation of conflict here in this area, and not only against well, in this case, it was actually the provincial office doing the negotiation. It wasn't the companies, because it's the project is a public-private consortium. Not only against the city hall, but also between them, because some families decided to accept it in fear of not ever getting anything whatsoever, while these people, especially this guy to the left, Ladina, and a group of other elderly people decided to resist. And yeah, I have this picture here, which Ladina, well, he let me take a picture, which is he carries this with him. The reason why this is a paper that he carries with the date of a demonstration, a protest that they did, trying to stop the machines from coming into their mashambas. And the paper is filled with blood, right? And it was his blood because he was attacked by the police and sent to jail. And yeah, and then he wrote the list of the people who were there. So it's a kind of him trying to build a testimony of what happened. But yeah, so this is a case of people without any kind of resources trying to fight for justice. And then, so what happened after this was actually that they sought help from the local branch of the UNAC, which was providing advocacy for them. They're still in this process. This protest was in 2018, and we're still, they're still struggling to find a solution, especially not in terms of preventing this from happening, but in terms of getting a fair compensation. So this was what was happening in Pemba, and then there's another case that I was looking at in Balama, in the graphite area, which was quite interesting because it was actually presented as this was a project. Sorry, just to backtrack a bit. This was a project that was implemented by an Australian CRIA, an Australian company, which was presented even by local, UNAC people and others as one of the few good examples of negotiations with the local communities, right? And just to backtrack a little bit more, of course, all this happens because there is a law and a regulation for this, right? So if you want to implement the mining process, you need to establish, you need to do the environmental impact assessments, you need to do the public consultations and all this. And this was one case where people from outside were perceiving that this actually worked well, that in terms of, people were duly compensated with new land in substitution of the land they lost for the project. And then they were given jobs, training and jobs in the mining company. But then in both in 2020 and 2022, there were news. This was, of course, in the middle of the COVID crisis. There was news coming out of people striking in this mine. So that's what actually kind of motivated me to go there in the first place, especially because these kinds of strikes are not at all common in Mozambique, right? Labor-related strikes. So yeah, then we realized that basically what happened, this is just a visit that I did earlier this year. I like the picture because this guy in the middle, Donsa, is looking at me with a very kind of suspicious, yeah, he's not, and it was, this was actually quite telling because of what was happening, because when we went to visit this community, this is in the impact area of the mining, they were really fed up and tired, not only of their fight against the company, but also fed up of people showing up and asking them, what was wrong, and then nothing changed. So they were tired of telling people, their grievances, and then nothing was actually changing for them. So the question was that, it was actually an articulation of several different processes. On the one hand, they lost their lands, which were good lands. They were given basically shitty lands for, there was an agreement that the company, which then in the meantime passed from being Serat to its subsidiary Twig. It's the same company. It's one of these obscure corporate movements, that they would buy the produce from these farmers. And so they set up a co-op, but they never went to buy anything. They promised energy, they promised water, running water. And also, of course, none of that happened. And then also the people that were given jobs in the mining industry were, in the first instance, they started complaining that they were being discriminated against people coming from Maputo or other parts of the country. For the same job, lesser salary, lesser compensations. And then when the COVID struck, everybody was sent home for several months. And then when they were being called back, none of them were called back, none of the local. So there was two strikes and two protests. All of them ended up in violence. On the meantime, things have resumed, right? But what I'm trying to say is that with the case of Pima and with this one, what is, of course, what we see here is already a sign of something that is actually more general to Mozambique, which is this logic of protesting, quote unquote, in the wrong way, which means that if you take the streets to protest, this is a movement towards being criminalized, and in the case of Cabo Delgado, being accused of being a terrorist and whatnot, right? And this is something that I actually see not only in terms of the extractive industry and social mobilizations, but actually more generally. And this is why, I mean, as I said to Tiago and Guy, I think, when we agreed to this presentation, this was some months ago. And in the meantime, a lot of stuff has happened in Mozambique and is happening today even. So I thought maybe we can just kind of end with a shift towards the more general debate to kind of compare. And so this is just a picture that was taken just a few days after the election in Maputo. But it raises this aspect. So what is the public space of protest, right? So you have what I noticed in terms of the extractive industry is a very powerful, to put it one way, office protest. So really insightful, really well researched and written reports denouncing this. you can make a really good collection. You say, well, yeah, it's all there. So it's really good in terms of the office and circulating this in certain kinds of rooms and platforms, but it's not in the street, right? So what happens when Mozambicans go to the street? So that's another kind of history that you can do. In Cabo Delgado, you see that they are, as everywhere else, beaten up and arrested, and so this led me to this kind of an involuntary comparison that I ended up doing, because I was in Mozambique in the aftermath during the day after the elections, and then following what was happening in the days after, realizing the continuities between these two dimensions. When I was looking at something that was more restricted to Cabo Delgado, and then realizing, well, in fact, this is what is happening generally, with this official criminalization of protest movements, right? So if you follow the official broadcasts, the TVN and whatnot, you see that there is this discourse, of course, even using the terrorist part, to explain, this violence that was happening in the streets of Maputo in the aftermath of the elections. Whereas, of course, anyone who's studied these kinds of protests, that there is always a counter-protest movement, infiltrations, and so the violence does not come necessarily from the participants themselves, right? It comes from different kinds of agents there on the ground, and it also comes, in the case of Mozambique, coming from the police and military forces, and of course realizing the level of violence and impunity with which these forces are acting upon the citizens. Leading to this very interesting quote by Venancio Mondlane, the leader of opposition who's leading these protests, saying, actually just a few minutes before he was gassed with tear gas, and the journalists, international journalists, interviewing him in the street a few weeks ago, saying that the real terrorists are actually in the heads of the army and the police, right? So, so kind of subverting this. But of course, you see that there's this constant, back and forth between what kind of projection does the official discourse perform upon this kind of protest, and by that I mean, of course, how the official, media is portraying, and how the political figures, especially people like Musi, are doing their public interventions. There is, of course, this logic of criminalization taking place, right? And and this, of course, I mean, this is just a nod to of course, that thing up there in the top right corner is of course the how YouTube is actually being used to channel several kinds of counter discourses regarding the official discourse regarding the protests. This idea of this one I think is particularly interesting in terms of the protest strategies that Mondlane is doing, right? Mondlane, of course, being I mean, of course, there's a lot of controversy around his figure and what he represents and what he defends and how he's doing this. But what's interesting is that he's, he represents, or he embodies or conveys actually what is just a very, very basic feeling of people, citizens in across Mozambique, of just being fed up of the traditional political system, which includes not only Frelimo as the hegemonic party, but also even the parties of the opposition, in particular, PNAM. So yeah, this aspect of paralização, right, which I think is, when we talk about social movements, we can actually explore the social paralysis dimension in terms of using paralysis. Well, maybe that's too much of a literal translation, but using this idea of stopping down as a tactic, as a strategy of protest. And I saw that also in Angola, especially in the framework of COVID, when there was a serious level succession of protests or attempted protests, that ended up in people being killed during the COVID period in Luanda. People started promoting this like staying at home protests so you see that there is a creativity here in terms of redefining the physical movement of actually of protesting in the streets. And I'm also invoking Angola not because of my own specific these are just a couple of pictures, people trying to do the counter argument to the official discourse of vandalism. This is from today, actually. I got this today. This is so this is where I also wanted to but very specifically, right? So not only comparing, how so when I started my research in Maputo, it was quite interesting because I was also using my Angolan activist connections to liaise with people in Mozambique, right? And realizing that in fact they were actually quite looking up at what was happening in Angola. So my impression from Angola is like the feeling almost like sad for the struggle that people have in Angola, right? Saying it's just not happening. They're just taking the streets, they're getting beaten up, they're going through all these processes, and nothing is changing. But then seeing that in Mozambique, people actually had a different opinion, saying, well, actually, you guys and people in Angola are actually doing something that we can't do here. Whenever we try to take the streets, I'm almost finishing. Yeah. So
No, don't worry. Okay. It's just the.
You're saying something. Okay. So. Yeah. So. I mean, this was one. People leaving. It's going well. Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's a time. Yeah. No.
Time now.
Yeah, exactly.
Many countries.
Yeah. Kids. So. Not only there is this kind of symbolic connection, and in fact, once you start looking into this, you realize that there are platforms of connection between Angolan political and Mozambican political activists. In fact, that was how I was able to engage with several people in Maputo. But also through, for example, the case of Azagaya, right, the famous Mozambican rapper who died actually last year, as you can see there, which was something that was really, really impactful, not only in Mozambique, but also in Angola. And this, of course, brings about the role of how the hip hop movements and conscious hip hop rap movements have in activism in both these countries. And in fact, even recently, people like I was listening to an interview with Iku Costa, the director is releasing a film about Mozambique, saying that, in fact, suggesting that, in fact, a lot of this uprising and discontent that you're seeing now in Mozambique, I mean, there's a longer trajectory. There's a history of protests, and we have people like Björn Bertelsen and others doing that history. But in fact, there's a more immediate connection, which has to do with with the impact of the death of Azagaya and what happened in the funerals and the social and in those they weren't necessarily protests, right? But they were people taking the streets in honor of Azagaya, and the violence that they suffered in that context was actually also a fuel for what was happening there, right? And Azagaya being an inspiration not only for Mozambican activists, but also for Angolan activists. And so what you see there are actually two examples of people in Angola, not only in Angola, but also in the Angolan diaspora. So a lot of the activists in Angola now, at least the ones that I was working with, are actually in Brazil. All of them now, they migrated to Brazil, but they're still, doing protests from Brazil. Regarding Angola, but in this case also connecting to Mozambique, and what you see there in the top, in the bottom right corner is actually a live transmission that Hitler Samusuku, who is one of the most, I guess, famous political activists in Angola, was doing a live transmission of. In this case, this was the homage, the public homage that was being done, in homage to these two, the lawyer and the Podemos activist were assassinated a few days earlier than that, earlier than this event. So it's, people transmitting and doing live broadcasts, but not only that, but also people like Hitler actually being part of what you could call an international support group for Podemos in Mozambique. Yeah, so you see that it's not just a symbolic support. There's something more than that, actually, trying to create a network here across the Portuguese-speaking, well, not only African, but also, of course, including Brazil. So the problem of Mozambique becomes a cause for Angolan activists, and then that brings the debate into Angola, and people being kind of political protagonists being kind of scared of what could be the consequences of what is happening in Mozambique for Angola, right? So yeah, so just a last slide, if that's okay. Sorry. Yeah, sure. It's just a reflection on this idea of size, shape, and form, right? So again, there's these different kinds of, I guess, lines that you could explore in this respect. One is that distinction that I was doing between the office and the street, in terms of social critique or mobilization. Yeah, the scope and the scale of these different kinds of movements, also these transnational connections, but also this other aspect which has to do. So when I was there in the early days of this, well, it seems like ages, but it's actually weeks ago. In the first days of the post-elections, when these protests started taking the streets, it was actually interesting being in the street and then entering these cafes and stuff and looking at the TV and how the TV was reporting and what you could see at the same time, and then realizing that there is a shape and a form to this activism that is framed from these kinds of mainstream media, right? And how that actually creates an epistemological field of how to talk about these movements, right? So the TV and the radio and whatnot were putting out these words of terrorism, of vandalism, right, to describe what was happening. And so everything that is being done, and hence the picture that I brought before, is actually a reaction against that kind of epistemology, right? So that is also the form that activism takes in this process, the necessity of counteracting hegemonic projection or discourse around what people are doing when they take the streets. Keeping in mind, of course, that, as I said before, a lot of this stuff, those of us who've been in these protests, that there is infiltration and counter demonstrations in terms of creating chaos and violence, to support the narrative of the vandalism and terrorism and whatnot. So yeah, maybe I can stop here, and then should we take the?
Yeah, we can stop it. Yeah, don't worry, I'll take care of it.
So maybe we can just check. Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah.
But maybe we can check if we have
People at home.
Yeah, so I think it's better to continue in English. I will just check in and we continue in English. Yeah. So,
I mean, they want to put the question in Portuguese and
yeah, you can ask in
you can translate
Portuguese
or
Who wants to go first?
I can, there was nobody else. Okay. I was listening to your presentation, and all of these cases that you were describing, sort of active environmentalist activism, more based in rural areas where people are really feeling like their land being torn apart by these extractivist projects, and their livelihoods also being threatened. And I was sort of trying to compare that to environmentalist movements that I know based in Portugal, right? So we have sort of the more urban movements, some of them based in Lisbon, and we have the more rural movements as well. And there is, I think, a big shift in the rhetoric of both types of environmentalist movements, right? Usually, for example, when you have more rural communities who are being affected by these extractivist projects, for example, we had big movements against lithium extractivism. So, exactly. And so these the rhetoric of these rural activists is more based around something that is happening right in front of them, and they're seeing unfold, right? It's their land that's being torn apart. It's their livelihoods that are at threat. So it's not just an environmentalist dimension to these movements, but also a materialist dimension, right? And we can compare that, for example, with more urban social movements, for example, Climáximo and the Greve Climática Estudantil, and their rhetoric is not so much about things that are exactly unfolding in front of the people, but it's more concerning like the end of the world and, you know, all of these prophecies regarding climate change that are very important and obviously, but in a certain sense, to working class people, they feel a little bit more abstract, right? Because we're trying to mobilize them based around these hypotheses about things that will probably happening, but at the same time, there's this sort of uncertainty because people don't see them unfold, right? And so we also have, for example, a few urban environmentalist movements here in Lisbon who have a little bit of expression, but their claims and their rhetoric are totally different compared to the rural movements. And for example, I'm part of a social movement where the environmentalist concern is not really present at all, which is a movement that's trying to mobilize more people in the periphery of Lisbon, sort of more marginalized communities and marginalized neighborhoods. And it's impossible to mobilize these people based on environmentalist topics, right? Because it doesn't really carry much weight in their lives. At least they don't feel it, right? They want to talk about salaries. They want to talk about working conditions. They want to talk about housing rights. That's something that they feel. But as opposed to what happens in rural areas, the environmentalist topic is not really something that carries a lot of weight. And I was thinking, I was listening to hearing those examples that you were mentioning, for example, in Cabo Delgado, the peasants, they were mobilized. And they were probably, I assume, mobilized because it was their livelihoods that was at stake. It was something that they couldn't ignore. It was unfolding right in front of them. And I was sort of wondering, in the cases that you studied in Mozambique and Angola, how would you sort of distinguish the dynamics of mobilization regarding these environmentalist causes in more urban areas versus more rural areas? Do you think that people in more urban areas in Mozambique and Angola, are they particularly concerned and also mobilized around environmentalist topics, or maybe not so much?
No, I think I mean, you're absolutely right. I think it's interesting how in some cases the global articulation becomes actually a motivating factor, and whereas in others it's like, as you're saying, it's just too abstract for them to connect with, and the environmental discourse has this dimension to it. I think very specifically, I think the case of Angola is actually quite interesting in that respect. So I've been working with these activists since they were in jail in 2015 in the Quinze Mais Dois process and things like that, and so we've been having a lot of these kinds of discussions, a lot of them around real democracy, human rights, etc. But then actually when I started doing my research in Angola, for instance, in southern in southern Angola regarding the environmental aspect, we started also having conversations around that. And it's interesting that that issue was posed. So on one hand, the way they were looking at these processes was actually saying, well, this is which is actually also my argument, academic argument, that this is you know, there's beyond the climatic discourse of El Nino or whatever, there's actually a political infrastructural problem going on, which is causing the disaster there. It's not just a lack of rain. And so they were assuming this in the framework of their own struggles, and it was actually in the middle of their mobilization around the implantation of autarquias in like local elections. So Angola doesn't have local autarquias, so there's this debate going on for decades. Local,
Municipalities.
well, they do have municipalities, but they don't have elections, so it's not a so there's this commitment that Angola has for that implementation. It never happened, of course, because the MPLA doesn't want to use power. So the activists are actually over the past years, they've been embracing this idea because they think, well, this is one space where we can actually exercise. I mean that's their hope, at least, that they, you know, this is one place where we can actually not have the MPLA governing us. And so they've been taking that and they put that in the framework of that, saying, well, you know, maybe if there was more horizontal forms of organization, less centralism. But then, so when I took my research back to Luanda, it was interesting is that we were discussing something to do together and trying to find a common ground, if you will. And we ended up talking about trash, which was their backyard, so to speak. It wasn't like major environmental discussions about carbon offsets or whatever. It was actually, you know, which was, so we ended up doing, in Angola, we call them monjangos, which are these like round circle meetings on trash and citizenship. That's what the concept. And they really, you know, everybody really embraced the idea of saying, okay, you know, this is one way in which we actually have another tool to, with which we can hold local governors accountable. So that, you know, they were translating this into a more specific and concrete example because, of course, the framework for this is that in a place like Luanda, there's been a long history of, well, not only it's a very dirty city in general, but there's been episodes of crisis with trash accumulation, of course, with health issues and whatnot associated to that. And, well, due to, of course, the political economy of handling trash. But so they could see that as, they could translate that into something that they could really easily put into their agenda. And, but on the other hand, like, I also brought you know, there's a Fridays for Future in Angola. So we made this discussion together, right? Saying, okay, how does someone from Angola, which was basically one guy or two people at the time, the Fridays for Future, two people, you know, having this discussion. Okay, so what does the FFF discussion? Yeah.
Question
Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, we can get back to that. But thanks.
Yeah. No, go for it. No,
So should I answer that? Yeah.
I think she was worthy.
Yeah, short one, but we can read it. I mean, as you. Thank you, Ruy. I was thinking of scales now because you show there's this international, imperial, and national scale, no, of way of reading process, etc. And you also showed about the long way, about extractivism and environmentalism. So I was wondering about the long way of social protest, about taking the streets. Is it this domestic space kind of the fact that it's so difficult to take the street, is it linked also to national history about the Renamo criminalization? Is it specific to Mozambique? What is specific to Mozambique and what is not? Because Gilets jaunes and Hong Kong movement also were very criminalized. It's not something that is specific of this it's since the 2000s, and there was also a lot of dialogue now about Gilets jaunes with the technique of the umbrella and gas and also in Hong Kong. And so I think there's these three scales are interesting how they are embedded in your you want to go?
No, so finish, but just tell we maybe take 2-3 questions
but
now.
Anyway, it was about history and the scales and how you see the specificity, national, global, or imperial also. It's very interesting.
Okay, thanks.
Do you want to go for the question there that Jamila Andrade asks?
So if I consider NGOs who have their fundings and salaries part of social movements, and if they do activism, Is there a difference between activism and the work of NGOs in the analysis?
There is someone else
So this, yeah.
ready, just that we collect 3 questions so that we can use it. No? If not, perfect.
Okay, yeah, just Carla, thanks. Yeah, it's a hard question, but I like it. No, because I think in a way I think that there is a formal level of comparison, especially in terms of tactics and of course these things don't happen, you know, isolated, right? So, you know, when I started talking about the case of Angola, it's actually very explicitly a movement that actually it was a reaction or a consequence to the Arab Spring, right? That's the context for that. So people started to mobilize, and of course, you know, the technological aspect of it was of course very important, of, you know, the capacity, the ability to access, you know, information through social media and stuff, and so that creates like a layer or a level of action that is actually of horizontal circulation, of learning from other examples and bringing them into this space. And I think the case actually of Mondlane, of these strategies, you know, the famous 4-phase strategy that he announced of protests, and how, you know, one is trying to be more creative than the other, and you know, that says something about that, right? What's interesting here is that there's of course a very local dimension to this, a very, you know, local genealogy, and in terms of you know, when I was talking about Azagai as a possible source for the current discontent, I mean, I'm not sure. I mean, that's just one thesis that is going around. You know, there is a genealogy of this, of attempted demonstrations, and there have been violent demonstrations in the past, but they've been, you know, extremely violent, extremely repressed. But also thinking about why and in what terms did these demonstrations appear, you know, on the increase in the price of gas or communications, or so there's these very local, you know, connections, right? But then there's the horizontal intersections, which are also make a lot of sense, right? So yeah, I think, I mean, I don't think I can answer your question like in a closed fashion, but I think that that's the work that we could actually explore, really interesting. And in fact, Samusuku is actually doing a PhD in Brazil, and he's doing a comparison between, he wants to, that's his project, to compare Angola and Mozambique in terms of these struggles. But there is a fact that people in Mozambique look at Angola, and Angola, people in Angola are looking at Mozambique in terms of these aspects. And in terms of the question by Jamila, yeah, I mean, I kind of grouped them here in this presentation, I would say, right? That kind of just put NGOs as one version of activism. In a sense, I'm open to the idea that they also do some form of activism, especially in terms of being able to do research and denounce certain situations and try to convey, you know, dimensions that are being hidden or occluded or whatnot. But it's also fair to question. I mean, it's not the same kind of activism, right? I mean, there is activism maybe in the sense, if very broadly, in a kind of a developmentalist sense of saying, well, you know, they're working towards social change and they're committed to, you know, human rights and democracy. So yeah, in a sense, they're a social movement on the ground doing things. But they're not activists in the same way as a political activist or human rights. Especially the kind of political activists that I'm talking about, I think they're certainly not an NGO. That's one thing that you can't really, and in fact, a lot of, I mean, I guess that's the one of the points that a lot of this activism is the kind of activism that I looked at in Angola, and this activism that we see on the street today is actually organic, necessarily organic, and maybe ideologically organic, in the sense that they're not interested in formalizing movements. So in the case of these protests now, it doesn't mean that all these people that are in the streets are podemos activists. They might be even Mondlane activists in the sense, it's similar, in that sense, it's similar as what happened in Angola in the last elections, right? So you have a situation in which there was a great growth of people voting in the UNITA. Well, it wasn't only UNITA, it was a united opposition front in UNITA, led by UNITA. But it doesn't mean that everybody voting them. In fact, I would say only about a third of them were actually UNITA active supporters. It was actually social movements getting together to vote something that is not the MPLA and saying, well, but yeah, so there's a point that these are not institutionalized movements at all. Many of them don't want to be, both because they believe, and this was a discussion that was happening in Angola between 2011 and 2014, that they don't want to formalize or institutionalize because then they become co-opted and they become recognized and they become, well, easily controlled, or they become what they are fighting against, right? The idea that if you be institutionalized, you become a party, you become part of the system that you're trying to break. So in that sense, it's radically different from an NGO kind of setting that relies on a more institutionalized recognition of these kinds of entities, which enables actually the ground for them to operate on the field. But then another discussion is precisely, what are the conditions of possibility for these NGOs? And in what context can they address aspects that are uncomfortable for the regime? And here again, I think in Mozambique, the NGOs have that space of critique. This is totally impossible in Angola. Any NGO that will somehow frame or denounce any kind of human rights violation would be themselves persecuted in one way or the other. But in Mozambique, you do have that space, but only at a discursive level. You don't have it at a physical level, so to speak, with people on the streets. But Jamila says, okay, I missed the role of development aid influencing citizenship. And yeah, good point. I mean, yeah. I think I'm not sure about this. I mean, I think there is in general a very clear level of support for an NGO type kind of activism, but not necessarily one of yeah, maybe I'm exaggerating these binary oppositions, but a street level activism. That is not at all. You won't see an NGO, sorry, a development channel aiding that kind of. I mean, you might have, but I don't know for the case of Mozambique. Maybe someone has more information. But in Angola, for instance, you would have like Soros Foundation, Open Society, funding some kinds of projects that activists were actually using as platforms or as training sessions. I don't know about the case of Mozambique, but I don't see like the Swedish embassy or the Norwegian Christian Aid Alliance or whatever it's called, putting money in these kind of things. Because another aspect of this is a class argument, right? That there is a certain level of elite intellectuality and even activism, which is radically different from those kinds of activisms that are in the Bairros trying to organize and so. But I should say that I'm kind of being my main reflections on this actually come from Angola. Mozambique is a space where I'm still kind of learning to navigate. So I might be actually, maybe there's things happening there that I haven't seen on the ground, But yeah, it's a very good point that we need to consider. Yeah.
I think Ruy wants to go for it.
Yeah.
Yeah. If Louise wants to say something as well.
Maybe
go for it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just jump into this question that I have one comment and a question, and the comment is about this last question. And I think I would like to add something maybe from the role of actors that we usually don't associate with social movements.
because I think that there are very different levels of performing activism, and depending on the context, I think that, for instance, in Europe, you have a lot of NGO that are definitely having an activist role. For instance, in the refugee movement in the Mediterranean Sea, or also the solidarity movement, you have NGO that also take a very strong political position in rescue people in the Mediterranean Sea, or in many different cases. I think that maybe the cases are very different, or we can see in certain countries like the United States, or in the case of New York, you have activists that are professional activists, like they are community organizers, a housing organizer, and they are paid. So I think that when we look at social movements, we have very different actors having specific roles inside. So, and it would be very interesting, I think your presentation already mentioned many different profiles, also, and I think it's super interesting, this the diversification of profiles, because we are used to see this in countries where maybe all the roles are more fixed. In Europe and the United States, or the roles of who is an activist, who is not, etc., are more stable. Maybe there, I don't know, there is the trajectories are I don't know, not so defined from the beginning. Like, so this can be very interesting. This also to reshape what we mean with being an activist or not. So, and also another point that I was thinking about how the different scales of the mobilization and all of the issue also are dealt with, like the local, national, and the international, transnational level of the issue of the environmental problems, because we know that in environmental mobilization there is always some kind of local issue. And in this case, the project, extractivist projects, etc., that does have a local impact. And now this local impact is framed in terms of global problems, in terms of energy production, etc. If there is which is which is the connection? If this global problem, climate change, or these kind of things, are more general and also I would say more connected also to I will not say ideological, but kind of a global project of change, like of societal change, is interconnected, if it's present, and how is it connected with the local issue? So if it's clear or not.
No, I think, I mean, there was, I think it becomes very evident in the environmental justice dimension where you have, very well-known and identified actors, which I think there are activists in that, very explicitly in self-framed activists, which are, very explicitly concerned with this idea of putting Mozambique in a global discussion, in the framework of these, not only in terms of denouncing what is happening in Mozambique, but, as, like a cause of global awareness on what is happening in Mozambique against, the major discourse about the new Eldorado, I call it the gospel of extractivism, this idea that it's bright future, and saying, well, there's a dark reality to this. So not only that, but also in articulating. So when I was talking about Total, I think it's a very good example of these movements actually putting themselves as a nexus in a global discussion about, these are global actors, right? So we need to put Mozambique in the framework of what is happening in, I don't know, Nigeria or Indonesia, or in terms of, because it's the same, physically, but of course it's the, what is Total today? It's a thing, right? It's a global thing, it's an articulation of ventures and subsidiaries, and it has a CEO, I guess, somewhere, but it's like something that involves thousands of people, right? So it's not
which have the capital of a small state.
Yeah. And
sometimes even bigger states.
Yeah. But so there's this aspect of putting themselves in the geography of these debates, right? Saying, well, you know, now we also need to look at Mozambique, but then also bringing strategies and epistemologies from other contexts into this case, using them to interpret and to address what is happening in Mozambique, right? So I guess it has its two dimensions, and then the professional kind of the profile of the activist. That it's a really interesting question, because I think yeah, and it connects a bit with Jamila's first question. You know, this, you know, there is a professional aspect to you know, a lot of this stuff, especially what I was talking about. But for instance, in Angola, it was quite explicitly we weren't talking at all about people who were getting money out of it.
Like
but
Portugal.
yeah, and in many cases, so in Mozambique, it was quite interesting that I was, you know, maybe on a Monday, I was talking to someone from one of these organizations, and they're, you know, they have a salary and they're producing documents saying, you know, it's corrupt government and this and that, and, you know, giving examples and details. And then on Tuesday, I was talking to an activist, you know, political activist, who was, you know, saying, oh, I need to find a way to get out of Mozambique because, you know, people, I can't talk. People are, you know, the police is chasing, you know. I'm like, you know, it seems like two realities. So on the one hand, this guy, anonymous activists, you know, who no one knows, is in this panic of, you know, being persecuted because he's doing activists. And then you have these other people, like professional people, doing these very, very strong criticisms. But on the other hand, like what you would see in Angola, that was an interesting case in terms of, you know, these trajectories and itineraries. So, you know, you have also a history of people doing activism, but then leaving activism, which is also an aspect that I was also very interested in the sense of not only people who get fed up of you know, get tired of this life, you know, just, you know, do I want to get beaten up? Do I want to go to jail again? Do I want another scar in my, you know, because it's hard, you know. I mean, you do it for a while, and then sometimes you feel you know, you raise your questions, and then because, you know, in places like Angola, it's not just a personal question. It's a collective, because, you know, you start doing activism, you know, it's not the threats that you might get individually, you know, your family is also threatening, so your family becomes an agent against activism, right? Discouraging you, saying that don't do that because then your father's going to lose his job, or your sister, you know, these kinds of, yeah, this was very common. But then you also have like people, you know, seeking what we were calling at the time like a career in activism, right? So a lot of people, especially those who are more, you know, barulhento, more noisy, you know, people started, oh, this guy, you know, we don't know him. He's just showed up from nowhere and he's being super aggressive in this. And there's always this idea that people are using that visibility that they gain as activists, so then they can be corrupted as an exit. So, you know, saying, well, you know, I'm in the MUSEC in Luanda. I have no options. Here's a way out. You know, I go and break some stuff. I'll you know, get beaten up. I'll do things so that people recognize me, and then I'm approached by someone to be, you know, they give me money, they give me a house, they give me a job. You know, so this also happened, yeah? Especially in Angola, because
Cooptation, because they want to co-opt, or
yeah, silence. They want to silence, so they, instead of before killing you, they will. That's another option that they, you know.
Case in the Arab Spring, where it was the most moderate case, and it was very largely started by Principal Monia Benami Kraibi, and about the different strategies in respect to all the other countries, that Morocco implemented a strategy of co-optation, so of activists of the Arab Spring, and it was also this also meant a small opening also in the, while it was already a little bit open, or more open than the other Northern African countries, but of course also a kind of silencing of the movements and the more disruptive requests of the movements. So it's like hybrid strategy of co-opting certain people, the most moderate, and then largely to be the structure of the regime of the state, but in a kind of course,
Yeah.
not so. I don't know if it's the case. Is this
Yeah, no, I mean,
cooptation
it's
of
more,
like some meaning that was
Yeah, to put it one way, it's more like a discouraging tactic in sense of
Okay.
getting people out of the way in terms of not,
Mhm.
which again, comparing with Mozambique, in Mozambique it could be much more violent.
Yeah.
These people are just executed, by these, and it happened with journalists and lawyers, Sistak and Carlos Cardoso and others, just being killed, executed, and now these guys here, Luanda and Elvino, yes. So it's much more dangerous, the case of Mozambique, as far as I can tell. In Angola, I explicitly saw people using that as a tactic and say, well, I mean, some people might not do it, and then they're approached, and then they get, they have this dilemma, what do I do? Do I solve my personal, my family struggles by accepting this bribe or a job or a house or a car or whatever, or do I keep,
Do I risk being killed?
Huh?
Do I risk being killed?
Yeah, but in Angola, yeah, but I mean, compared to Mozambique, I think it's Mozambique is worse. In Angola, you've had people being killed, but more in the framework of yeah, not yeah, because one thing I mentioned that, of course, that I forgot to mention is that, at least in the case of Angola, these activists have a very high profile in terms of they're very well known,
Okay.
and they use visibility as a protection.
Yeah.
So and that was a really interesting kind of acknowledgement that they would use. It was actually quite funny and contradictory in the sense that they would use Facebook a lot for for putting themselves out there so people would know them as a protection, but they used Facebook because Facebook was a part of a Facebook One campaign that the owner of Unitel, former owner Isabel dos Santos, made an agreement with Mark Zuckerberg, so they could have free Facebook for any phone having a mobile plan. So you didn't have to have a mobile data to use Facebook. So it was like a way of generalizing the use of Facebook across Angola. And then they started using that as a platform because it was free, and you didn't, because data is also expensive, right? But then it was also a way of people putting their faces out there, so they wouldn't be anonymous, so the danger of being killed is actually when you're like more anonymous, people don't know who you are, and so people just, you can be disposed of very easily, so to speak. Whereas the more known you are, the lesser the chance of you having this kind of elements, right?
But to be co-opted and be, yeah.
Yeah, no, but even, I mean, it's really hard because, I mean, like, half of the people that I worked with, for a while, like half of them had been co-opted or been offered like positions, money, salaries. Luckily, they haven't been killed, at least the ones that I remember. But it does happen also, yeah.
Well, do we have more questions?
You?
No, I'm happy with
You agree with everything.
I agree. No, I was thinking it's very interesting. I was reading I was skimming through a PhD of a friend of mine who's finishing right now, and she works on the other side. She works on how lawyers and like this global network of lawyers work to establish contracts in Mozambique and do these kind of extractions.
Okay.
And so she works in London, Lisbon, Maputo kind
Okay.
of network and like all the scales in the world system. And she uses a funny expression that it's speaking of scales of the global in local, which is kind of like what you see here as well, right? It's like local, like what the global justice movement used, but like how these global companies then interfere in local issues as well and are present and bring the global to the local. Anyway, and I had questions about, I think, I think you make the distinction really well between like more Western type of approach
Yeah.
and those what has been called environmentalist of the poor, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you know that literature. Yeah, which is basically around this,
Yeah.
and goes around mainly anti-extractivism projects.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know, but I was, yeah.
She's trying to speak.
Yeah, we can't hear.
I think she left.
Hello.
Yeah,
Hello?
say something where we
Yes.
can.
Yes.
Can
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Ruy, for the presentation. I would like to keep in touch. That's why I'm talking, because I am from Mozambique. I'm doing PhD in Coimbra. I'm working on women's resistance to extractive industry in Mozambique from an ecofeminist perspective. And I would like also to add some more questions to the debate. The audio it's not very good to listen to you, but maybe we can keep in touch. I don't know.
Sure.
Yeah. Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank you. Yeah, that's also a very important dimension that actually I mentioned LSA. I forget the
Wilza, yes.
Wilza, is that?
But they are closed for some years now. They are closed.
Okay, I didn't know.
Yeah.
But they did one of the pioneering reports on what was happening in
Yes. They were the only research women's, but they
Yeah.
work on laws and they used to work, but now they are closed. Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know that they are doing.
Yes.
But I think there's still other movements in that respect and other people working in that.
Yes.
So
There are a lot. Yeah, actually, as you said, Maputo, I don't know how to say it in English. The activism, this type of activism is very strong. But in terms, but actually, what I was missing in the presentation, and also is historical. No, there's historical perspective in that. There is how the development aid, the financing these institutions, how do they manage this between individual activism and compromise with the organization's internal agenda as well.
yeah.
Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, that's a great debate. Yeah, please, maybe by email.
Yes, I got your in the presentation. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's another, it's a whole thesis right there.
Yes. No, but it's important I think it's important because otherwise we put in the same basket every type of citizenship or political engagement, and I do not believe that's correct for me. I think that's why I think concepts and how do we manage in contextualizing the place, how the historical how the constructions are made historical now about in terms of participation in the citizenship arena, kind of that.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
I
Jamila.
forgot to mention, just a quick note, I forgot to mention in terms of what Jamila said and you were saying before, that there is also an interesting level, the level of lawyers, lawyer activism, so to speak, in these frameworks that I kind of forgot to mention. That is, of course, also very relevant. Yeah.
No, it's true. Like Kathleen is doing that really interesting work. I haven't had the time to read it properly, but just came through it. But anyway, do you want to close the session? No, go for it.
Well, I close the session. Thank you very much for joining us today. And we have the next session thank you very much, Ruy, for being here. It was a very nice session. I have to say they are all nice. But we had also very nice discussion, and it's a topic that is really kind of unknown also, so I think it's very, very special. And also we had here people that this was the first time we see here, and I hope to see you here again, maybe in the next seminars.
And thank you very much for joining us. The next session will be in
On the 11th?
the 11th of
Am I
December,
wrong?
and it will be about urban movements in Lisbon, and it will be about everyday forms of resistance in the context of social movements in Lisbon. And okay, thank you very much. And you can see, if you want to watch again this fantastic talk, and you miss Ruy, you can watch again the video on our website and all the other videos of the other sessions. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Os fechos, não é?
Sim, isto